This video focuses on the poetry of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. To start with Emily Dickinson, she is a poet who has a high stature in American literary history. She is known as one of the top American poets. Although there has been this sort of myth created about her actual person, that is, she mythically was a recluse who was eccentric and death obsessed. She was a spinster. Our book points out that probably there is a bit of truth in these descriptions, but the reality is probably a bit different from this representation of her. During her lifetime, she only published a handful of poems, around 10 to 12 poems. And in looking at the poetry too, in reference to the poems, you should use the first line of the poem as the title. There are two numbering systems, but it gets a little confusing if you just use the numbers. So use the first line as the title of the poem. The characteristics of her poetry are ones that tie her, indicate she is one who's very forward-thinking. She is typically seen as one who is transitional and leads us into the modern period of writing in the 20th century. Now we're talking about a writer here, though, who passed away in the 1880s, so a bit before the beginning of the 20th century, but she is an excellent example of a writer who doesn't fit firmly into a literary time period that she might be assigned to. For her, too, I would identify her perhaps with some qualities of romanticism, some qualities, too, of realism, and some qualities of modernism. So she definitely is one who can't be pigeonholed, in other words. You see the experimentation in her writing and the dashes that she uses and the fragmentation that she uses. There is strong unity within her poems, a unified impression that she wants to create, a unified emotion that she wants to represent. She also typically wrote in a pattern that was pretty typical of her time period for the structure of nursery rhymes and also songs of the period. For example, you can, with almost all of her songs, all of her poems, I should say, put them to the tune of the song The Yellow Rose of Texas. Now, you might not know that song, but one of my students pointed out that she had found on the internet a couple of years ago that you can put Emily Dickinson's poetry, or at least most of it, to the tune of the theme song of Gilligan's Island. And if you look on the internet, you can find examples of where people have attempted to do that, and it seems to work. Now, on the one hand, there is this structure that she uses with the 14er, but on the other hand, she breaks those structures with the experimentation with other elements. Interestingly, too, one of my friends a number of years ago wrote an article about Emily Dickinson's what has been described as her as anorexia nervosa that she suffered from. There's a lot of indication that this is something that she dealt with during her life, and that you can, in her poetry, look at her poetry too, and see the representation of what she was dealing with the anorexia, and things like the use of small bits of food and starvation too. The first poem I would like to take a look at, and we're only going to focus on two of her poems today. The other ones I'd encourage you to make sure that you're taking a look at, but I want to focus on two. Because I Could Not Stop for Death is over on page 1683. This is one of her best-known poems. The persona of the poem, I think we can assume the persona is a female. The persona has a gown made of gossamer, a thin fabric, and a scarf the scarf covering that is also made out of a thin fabric. And I point this out too because the fabrics, I think, suggest something about where the persona is now. We find out from the last stanza that it has been centuries, but it seems like it's been shorter than a day since the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, the persona is in a carriage, and the carriage stopped for her, the opening of the poem points out. The carriage stopped because I could not stop for death. The persona says it was next to impossible to slow down, but death stopped her. And death is represented as a very kind carriage driver who picks her up and carries her along, and they are in this carriage which is going toward eternity. That's what's meant by the last stanza. The only other thing, person, or whatever in the carriage with them is immortality. Notice the way that these descriptions in the poem are used. She says, we slowly drove, because they are moving toward eternity or through eternity. The carriage driver knows no haste, and she had put away her things that she was doing in her lifetime. She ultimately put these things away, but this is not a person. This was a person who was leading an active life, and death cut things short for her. As they make their way toward eternity, they pass a school where children strove. At recess in the ring, we pass the fields of gazing rain. We pass the setting sun. Notice the focus on circles here, circles of the seasons, for example. And notice, too, the representation of childhood, adulthood, and the setting sun. The passing at the end. I think that is intentional. She says in the next stanza too that it seemed like they were going somewhere, but then she realized, no, the sun actually passed us. She gathers her tippet around her scarf around her, because it is becoming colder as she, I guess, recognizes that she is headed toward eternity. They stop in the next stanza at her grave, and then the horses proceed to take them toward eternity. This is a topic that she dealt with in quite a few poems. And the other one I would point you to, and I'm going to be covering it quickly here, the other one I would point you to is A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. See if you can figure out what this narrow fellow is. This is one of her riddle poems. It is about nature. She oftentimes writes about nature. And I'm going to ask you the question in the discussion section if you can guess what the narrow fellow is, and if you can give evidence for why you believe it is what you think it is. And we can discuss that a little bit online. Now, the other poet for today is Walt Whitman. He did see himself as responding to Emerson's call for an American poet. He deals with nature, but he also writes about the city life. He lived in New York, and so you see the representation of America at its fullest, not only the rural, but also the city life. He again and again worked to revise his book, Leaves of Grass. In that revision, never fully believing, too, that he could realize perfection with it. This is a romantic quality. A little aside here, too, that he worked as a nurse during the Civil War. He saw himself, too, as a poet of democracy, trying to pull together the voices of all sorts of Americans from all classes, from all walks of life. His verse is experimental in form too, primarily in large part because he does use free verse here. The poem that we're focusing on here is Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking. This poem exemplifies some of the qualities that you see in the rest of his poetry. He loves to give lists and catalogs. And here, these descriptions that he loads on top of each other. If you look at Song of Myself, another one of his poems, a much longer one, you see even more of that cataloging, though, those description upon description. Notice, too, the repetition of the opening words, out, 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 over, down, up, out, the use of prepositions here. The emphasis, though, that he is coming out of the cradle, endlessly rocking. This poem is about birth, and specifically the birth of the poet. The italics in the poem are the words of the he-bird. Obviously, here we have the story of the persona who is looking back to when he was a boy and when he saw these two birds, the male bird and the female bird. The story that happens here is that the male bird and the female bird, they have a loving relationship. They have built a nest together, but we don't know what happens, and he doesn't know what happened, but she disappears. She never comes back. And the implication is that she has died. If she was still alive, it looks like she would come back to him, but she doesn't. The main section of the poem in italics is the bird who is grieving over his lost love. There is reference at the bottom of page 1390 to this Song of the Bird as being an aria. We see in Whitman the influence of music. Here specifically, these words are connected to opera, aria being like the very elaborate part where the soprano shows like how high up she can go and how long she can sustain like really elaborate stretches of song. The recitative is where we get just kind of the storyline. But there's reference to the italics part of the poem, the bird's song about his loss of his loved one, as the aria. What we see after the aria ends is a shift into where the poet, the persona, talks about this being a time, hearing this bird, and the bird's song as a time that awoke him. It is a time over on page 1391. Now in a moment I know what I am for. I awake, and already 1,000 singers, 1,000 songs, clearer and louder and more sorrowful than yours. 1,000 warbling echoes have started to life within me, never to die. This is poetic inspiration for him. This is when he recognizes what he wants to do, that he wants to be the poet. He has been moved so much by this bird's song, the beauty of the bird's song, so motivated to write too about what he heard. And by the end of the poem, there is reference to the sea birthing him. The natural world has been inspiration for him and has given birth to his role of poet. I'll leave you with the question, do you see any similarities between this poem and other ones that we have read this semester? Perhaps there are some poems that deal with the natural world and elements of the natural world that bring inspiration to poets. And I'd encourage you to start looking for connections like this, because this is going to play a role in your final exam.